Hello, Wisconsin course participants. I am Kimberly Schoger, an instructional designer working on behalf of the Wisconsin Digital Learning Collaborative. Good work on your progress thus far. I hope that in this course, you are catching a vision of how to capture the benefits of blended learning to improve your students' experience. Today, I am very fortunate and excited to be talking to Heather Clayton Staker. Heather is president of Ready to Blend and a former senior research fellow in education at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. She is also one of the world's foremost experts on K-12 blended learning and co-author of the book, Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools, which she wrote with Michael B. Horn. As I said, she's also the founding president of Ready to Blend, which is an Austin, Texas-based company that works all over the world to facilitate blended learning to improve instruction in schools. Welcome, Heather. It is so great to see you.
Hi, Kimberly. It's great to talk to you.
Our listeners have just viewed a video module detailing the 7 models of blended learning, including station rotation, lab rotation, one of my favorites, the flipped classroom. We've talked about that before. Individual rotation, flex, a la carte, enriched virtual, all of those models of blended learning. And today I'm hoping to add to that body of knowledge by discussing guidelines for selecting the appropriate models for those various learning settings and learning situations.
That's great.
So in your book, Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools, you walk the reader through 6 questions that educators should address when choosing the best blended learning models for their needs. By the way, that is a great approach to this type of decision making because it gives you that guideline of what questions should I ask to be able to implement this. So Heather, what are those 6 questions?
Yeah, so I think it's important before talking about those 6 questions to just note that at that point in the book, when we get to those 6 questions, we've already walked through a bunch of other preliminary questions around what are the problems you're trying to solve at your school, or what opportunities do you see for your learners that can help make their experience richer and improve their achievement and their well-being. And then really thinking through what is the student experience? What are the different ways to use all that we know about the science of learning to create a better learner experience, one that really helps solve those problems we're trying to tackle. And it's only after doing that design work of identifying the goals and the intention behind all of this, and then creating the user experience that we then can say, all right, which blended models are the right ones to plug in here to bring about that student experience. Excellent. So I feel like that context is really important. Once though you have a strong hypothesis for these are the pillars or the elements that we need to put into our student experience to allow for whatever it is you're trying to do, maybe more small group instruction, maybe more individual tutoring, maybe better coaching, maybe more opportunities for peer collaboration or fun with friends or project-based learning. There's a number of different experiences that you might want your learners to have. Only after you've done all of that design work do you think through which models then do we need to put into place to activate those experiences for our learners. So back to your original question, what are the 6 things to look at? So once you're at that point where you have your design ambition in place, the 6 questions involve what type of problem is it? And I'll get into that more with you if you'd like. What type of team do you have the appetite for bringing to bear to solve this problem? What do you want students to control? What do you want the primary role of your teachers to be? That really influences what model you should choose. What physical space can you use? And then how many internet-enabled devices do you have? So in some ways, those 6 questions are just to help look at your reality. And in some ways, your design constraints and say, given our vision for the student experience, and then given our reality and what's possible, which models could we use to make this happen?
Excellent, excellent. So for that first question, what problem are you trying to solve? You introduced 2 types of problems, and you ask your reader to categorize their problem into one of those 2 types. What are those 2 types, and how does that distinction between the 2 change the way you're going to address the problem you're trying to solve?
The 2 types of problems, first one is problems that relate to core mainstream students in core subjects. And then the second types of problems relate to non-consumption problems, which is a fancy word that we use in innovation science to think about areas where the alternative is nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
So for students that are mainstream students in core subjects, oftentimes the best models of blended learning to use for them initially are like station rotations, lab rotations, flipped classroom, because they already have a whole scope and sequence in place for their curriculum. They have subject matter experts in the building that have their lesson plans, and to go in and say, look, shelf all of that and let's do a really what we would call disruptive model of blended learning that's like a flex model or an a la carte model that requires completely transforming teaching and learning, that encounters a lot of operational resistance. So it's better to match those mainstream students' core subjects initially with more sustaining models, like a lab rotation or a station rotation or a flipped classroom that just improves upon what's already happening in that classroom. Conversely, there's students who have gaps, who can't access opportunities in their educational experience. So maybe there are electives that are out of reach. Maybe they're incarcerated, and so there aren't a full selection of choices. Maybe they are really in a rural area, or maybe they're lacking summer school options. Those are all what we would call non-consumption areas, where the alternative is nothing at all. Those students oftentimes just don't even have access to a certain course or learning experience. And for them, they're a great match for some of what we would term the more disruptive models of blended learning. So you could try a flex model or an individual rotation or an a la carte model or an enriched virtual model. For one thing, oftentimes those more disruptive models are easier to access. You don't necessarily have to have an on-site subject matter expert, and so it's easier to deliver them. And then also you meet less organizational resistance because there's not someone in the building who's protecting their turf. Instead, the building's delighted to have some opportunity to provide for those learners who just otherwise would go without. So that's the first question.
A lot of opportunity there. Yes, absolutely. So I love this idea of one of your guidelines is assembling a team of professionals to solve problems. In educational psychology, we call that a community of practice that come together to solve problems and address issues. What we don't always think about, though, is that different types of teams should be matched to different types of problems. So you discuss 4 different team types. What are those 4 types and how do they differ in their ability to solve those various problems?
So great innovators have identified that depending on the scope of change you're trying to bring about, you really need the right kind of team. So if you're trying to bring about a small change, just like within the classroom or within a department, a functional team will do the job, where it's just those classroom teachers or that department that bring about the change. If you're trying to bring about a change that requires coordination across the building or across the district, then you want to use a lightweight team where there's a manager that coordinates across the different departments to bring about a collective response. Third type of team is called a heavyweight team, and that's when you're trying to really re-architect the system. So suppose you want to change fundamentally curriculum and staffing, facilities, budgets. You need to re-architect the system. You need a heavyweight team. And that's made up of experts from across the organization who co-locate and they represent the interests of the heavyweight team until they've solved the problem, and then they can disband and go back to their respective organizations. So that's the heavyweight team. And then finally, an autonomous team. They're the ultimate in terms of giving them a lot of autonomy to be able to really redesign the system for a disruptive model, to do something that's so different from how the traditional system does it that you hardly recognize it anymore. You want to give them maximum autonomy so that they can really recreate. So the question here, question number 2, when you're choosing the model is, what do you have the appetite for and what kind of team would best solve the problem that you have in mind? So if you're just doing a flipped classroom for one science course in one high school class, then you can just use a functional team. But if you say, look, we just got the funding to bring about something more architecturally different for our district, and we want to bring about a bigger change, then you're going to want a heavyweight team, and that puts you in the in the direction of being able to pull off a more complex like station rotation, lab rotation system. If on the other hand, you say, we're going to do something disruptive, we want an autonomous team that's going to try something very different, then you're in a good place to be able to bring about a flex model, a la carte, enriched virtual or individual rotation.
Excellent, excellent. Some of our listeners may be questioning whether or not they have sufficient facilities to make blended learning a reality in their schools. How can schools best use the physical space they already have, they have available to them, to implement those blended learning models? And maybe you can give us an example of a school that was challenged by those constraints and how they overcame those constraints and implemented blended learning.
Sure. So the third question to ask when you're choosing which blended model to use is, what physical space can we use? And if you only have your existing classrooms and they're kind of the classic standard smallish size classrooms, then oftentimes the best model for you would be like a station rotation or a flipped classroom. If on the other hand, you also have a media lab or a computer center, you could do a lab rotation. If you have a large open learning space or a set of classrooms, you can move down the walls and create a large open learning space. And oftentimes we're seeing new schools develop these more open learning spaces. That gives you the opportunity to do a flex model or an individual rotation or an enriched virtual, because those learners come in and you want to be able to vary the learning formats, vary the modalities. And so by having a larger space where you can have like a Socratic seminar in one corner, an individual tutoring somewhere else, and learners doing a work sprint online in another spot, it really gives you that flexibility when you have more open space. And then finally, if you're comfortable with your learners working in any safe supervised setting, then you could do an a la carte model where learners are working entirely online with an online teacher of record and just attacking an online course on their own.
And really giving students agency in setting the pace and the path of their own learning.
That's right.
That's great. You state in the book that the availability of internet-enabled devices will also be a determining factor when selecting blended learning models. How does that availability of devices inform which blended learning models will be possible?
Yeah, so the fourth question to ask is, how many internet-enabled devices do you have? So if you only have enough for a fraction of your learners, then you're best set for a station rotation or a lab rotation. Because say you have a classroom of 30 students and you only have 10 devices, well, you could have 3 stations and a third of your students online with those 10 devices, while the other 2/3 are at different stations that are offline. So it's a good way to hack your system. If you don't have enough devices for everyone, you can still do a blended model that's more personalized, more individualized, but only having a portion of your learners online at a time, or a portion of your learners in the computer lab and do a lab rotation while the rest are doing offline activities. If you have enough for all of your learners to use during class, and then you can do a flex model where they really have the opportunity to use that learning management system as the backbone of delivering their content. And then you also could do, and then if you have enough of your learners both at school and at home, then you're talking about flipped classroom, where they can start doing some of their learning at home before they come to school. You're talking about a la carte model where they can do a fully online course, or an enriched virtual model where maybe they'll do like two days off campus and a day on campus.
Love that. Lastly, you provide some great examples of how schools have moved toward employing multiple models of blended learning. Can you tell us about maybe one of those schools, a success story, if you will, of how they employed a more dynamic approach to selecting the blended learning models, and then how that evolved?
So the first time that I saw an enriched virtual model was when we were living in Honolulu, where my family was living in Hawaii. And there was a school on the North Shore, on the other side of the island of Oahu, that set up a school to serve learners from all over the island, but they also catered to professional surfers and learners that lived on other islands. And so it wasn't really feasible for some of those learners to come to school every single day. And so they set up an enriched virtual model so that those learners could come to school maybe 2 days a week, 2 days a month, depending on their circumstances. Some who were flying in from other islands really truly only came once a month. And then the rest they did remotely. So it was so good at tailoring the schedule to the needs of those different learners. And the learners that were off in Australia at a surfing contest were able to come to school just when they were in town. And it allowed for them to explore this area of excellence in their lives. And then meanwhile, the learners that were near the North Shore and wanted to come every day had that opportunity. And then you asked also about combining models. And that was another place that they got really creative. So even if they're doing enriched virtual and the learners aren't necessarily coming to school every day, when they are in school, it still leaves the question, what's the right model then? And so they were able to experiment with station rotation and flex models on site to really maximize that face-to-face time. So oftentimes you'll see schools combining models in that way, where they'll say, yeah, we'll do flipped classroom. And then when our learners are on site, what's it going to be? Is it lab rotation? Is it station rotation? Is it flex model or individual rotation? They have to think about that. And so even though the models appear to be collectively exhaustive in the sense that it's hard to spot a lot of blended learning happening that doesn't seem to fall within one of these models, they don't seem to be mutually exclusive in the sense that we're seeing models oftentimes combining and educators bringing them together. Again, though, the more sophisticated you get with blended learning, the less you even rely on these words anymore, because it's all about bringing about a certain student experience. And if you had to force the teacher to say what she's doing, she might say, well, I guess technically it's the station rotation, but she doesn't really think about it anymore like that, because what she's thinking about is, well, we're doing high agency with a lot of data-driven instruction. And that's more what she's thinking about, because she's thinking about what are the pillars that I'm trying to bring about for my student experience.
Exactly. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation today to help our learners begin to or continue to implement blended learning in their school districts or in their schools?
I'll just mention that in the book Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools, we walk through the 6 questions in detail and really guide you through them. So if you want to go through that exercise of thinking about your circumstances and then having a guided experience, that's possible through the book.
It's so valuable, absolutely. And we couldn't go into every detail today that, of course, is included in the book, but having that information at your fingertips and be able to make these innovative changes is really an incredible opportunity.
Good, thanks.
How can people get in touch with you if they need your help, Heather?
So readytoblend.com, we offer all sorts of workshops and experiences to help you make it easier for you to bring about high quality blended learning for your students, so that your students have tailored experiences that give them more agency and help improve their achievement and well-being.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I've listened to several of the podcasts at readytoblend.com. Just wonderful. Some professionals and experts out in the field just giving amazing information. So I recommend those as well.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Heather, for your enlightening, your informative responses. I love the idea of schools offering a portfolio of options pursuant to the needs of the learner. That's a quote from your book. It's time for change in our schools, and you are really spearheading that mission. And I admire you for that, and I congratulate you on that as well.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Thanks for joining us today.